Constraints are created between entities. In fact, they exist specifically to relate one entity to another in an assembly. After constraints are defined, some of the constrained entities can disappear for a variety of reasons, resulting in broken constraints. For instance, this can happen when a component's geometry changes, eliminating a constrained face or edge, or when a workplane is accidentally deleted or suppressed. When you replace a component, Inventor tries to automatically repair the constraints, so some of the constraints might be okay, some might be broken, and others might not have an error, but they are constrained to the wrong entity. In this case, I'll be replacing the blue base plate with another component. I'll click the Replace icon and select the base plate, which opens the Place Component dialog. I'll select Replacement Plate, and when I click Open, a warning dialog about constraint loss displays. Inventor warns me that constraints and possible existing mates may not be replaced for the part being placed in the assembly. Since I want to replace the part, I'll click OK. When I do, you can see that a list of errors appears. Inventor is trying to repair the constraints for the component that we are trying to replace, but these constraints are broken and will need to be created again. So I'll go ahead and click Accept to have the assembly update with the new base plate, and we can see that the new plate has been rotated as well. I'll expand the replacement plate and move the cursor over the constraints so I can see the faces when they highlight in the graphics window. I'll need to edit each of these 4 constraints and select a new face on the plate, but I should spend a few seconds making sure I know how to correct the constraints. The first constraint positions the side of an end bracket. The second one positions the edges of the end brackets. The third one positions the side of the other end bracket. And the last one mates the end brackets to the top of the plate. If you look at the component names, you can see that 3 of them are for Connect 2, and only 1 is for Connect 1. At this point, it looks like the best strategy is to get the brackets on top of the plate, then fix the constraints for the first end bracket, and finally the constraint for the second end bracket. Since constraint conflicts can cause the components to move to unexpected positions, I usually suppress the other constraints before editing one. Also, if an error does occur, I know there is another problem with the assembly I need to resolve. I'll suppress the 3 flush constraints. And then I'll right-click on the made constraint, select Edit. I just have to click on the second selection button to clear it. Click on the top face of the plate, and click OK. Even though the constraints are suppressed, the geometry still highlights when I pause the cursor over them. I'll unsuppress the first flush constraint and edit it so the end plate is in position. The other end plate also moves because there are constraints between them. Next, I'll unsuppress the flush constraint for Connect 1. The constraint conflict dialog displays, but I'll click Continue. I'll edit the constraint and select the end face. Finally, I need to unsuppress and edit the constraint for the edge faces of the brackets. Now that the parts are back in place, I need to check to make sure the constraints are still correct. When you replace a part, you usually have to replace some constraints or adjust some offsets. For this assembly, I didn't have to replace any constraints, but I do need to make some adjustments. The new plate has a chamfer, so I need to move the edges of the plate back. I'll just double-click the constraint to display the Offset Edit field, and then I'll click the arrow and select Measure. Next, I'll select the side face of the plate and the edge of the chamfer, and then click OK. If the parts move in the wrong direction, I can just edit the offset and make the value negative. If you look at the assembly from the top, you can see the end plates cover up the mounting holes. Rather than measure the distance, I'll just try some offset values until I settle on one that leaves clearance for the hole. When I click on the constraint, an Edit field displays at the bottom of the browser. I need to have the same offset on the other end, so I'll just update it to match. You can see the end plates clear the holes. In this example, all of the constraints were kept intact, even though the parts ended up in the wrong position. I was able to quickly make changes to update constraints on the offsets. If the constraints had failed, there are a couple of options. You can delete the constraints and create new ones, or you can edit them to select new geometry. Whether you repair constraints or create new ones depends on the type of errors and how many there are. Each assembly is different, and you can end up deleting some constraints, repairing the rest, and then creating new ones to finish the task.